They called her the Shadow. For 3 years, Dr. Anya Sharma had drifted through the pristine, antiseptic-scented halls of Sterling Memorial Hospital, a ghost in faded blue scrubs that always seemed a size too large. They saw the limp, a slight, almost imperceptible drag of her left foot that she never explained. They saw the intricate web of silvery scars that covered the back of her right hand, a hand she often kept tucked into her pocket. They saw the quiet, bone-deep exhaustion in her eyes, the way she moved without making a sound. And they dismissed her. She was a burnt-out resident, they whispered by the nurse's station, a charity case the hospital kept on for reasons no one could quite fathom, lucky to even have a place pushing chart racks and running labs. She was background noise, a part of the humming, beeping machinery of the hospital itself. Dr. Alistair Finch, the Golden Boy, chief of surgery, had made her his personal punching bag. He was everything Anya was not. Loud, immaculately tailored, radiating a glossy confidence that bordered on theatrical. His Rolex gleamed under the OR lights, a stark contrast to the worn analog watch on Anya's wrist. He found a special, cruel joy in singling her out. "Sharma!" he would bark across a crowded conference room, the sound sharp enough to make others flinch. "Did you manage to get the coffee order right today? Or is that particular multi-step procedure beyond your capabilities as well?" Laughter, sycophantic and eager, would ripple through the junior doctors who orbited him like nervous moons. Anya would just nod, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond him, her voice a low, raspy whisper when she replied, "Yes, sir. It's on your desk." The rasp was another mark against her, another sign of weakness in Finch's eyes. He didn't know the rasp came from a shrapnel wound to her throat, an injury sustained while she was commanding a field hospital during a mortar attack. He didn't know that the hand she used to fetch his double-shot, no-foam latte had once performed a miraculous open-heart massage in the back of a bucking, smoke-filled helicopter. He didn't know the limp came from a shattered femur, the result of shielding 2 wounded soldiers from a secondary blast. He didn't know that the burnt-out resident had published papers on trauma surgery under a classified designation that were now required reading at Walter Reed. They didn't know, and Anya never told them. Humiliation was a kind of armor. Anonymity was a fortress. She just did her work, her movements economical and precise, whether she was suturing a simple laceration in the ER or cleaning a spill in the hallway. She endured. She observed. She waited, though she wasn't sure what for. Today, the cruelty was particularly sharp. Finch stood at the head of the surgical amphitheater, a king addressing his court. He was outlining a complex aortic valve replacement, his laser pointer dancing across a projected diagram. He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. The key here is precision, an artist's touch, something that requires a certain pedigree, not the clumsy fumbling of, say, our dear Dr. Sharma. He gestured vaguely toward the back row where Anya sat, taking notes on a worn pad. "Sharma, stand up. Tell these future surgeons the most critical first step in a high-risk cardiac procedure." The room went silent. All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly, the fabric of her scrubs rustling. The air thickened with anticipation of her failure. She looked not at Finch, but at the diagram on the screen. "Securing the airway is always the first step, sir," she said, her voice barely audible but clear. "But in this specific case, given the patient's documented history of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, the most critical step is pre-operative confirmation of an alternative anticoagulant protocol to prevent catastrophic clotting. A dead silence followed. Finch's smirk faltered. He hadn't mentioned that complication. It was buried deep in the patient's file, a detail he'd clearly missed in his haste to preen. For a split second, a flicker of raw fury crossed his face before he masked it with a dismissive laugh. A lucky guess from the cheap seats? Thank you, Sharma, for that stunningly obvious contribution. Now, if you'll excuse us, I have to prepare for a surgery that actually matters. You can handle the post-op chart filing for the 3rd floor. Try not to get any of your residue on them. He turned his back on her, the dismissal absolute. The tension broke. The sycophants chuckled. Anya simply sat down, her expression unreadable. She picked up her pen and in the margin of her notes drew a small, perfect, 5-pointed star. They didn't expect the quiet woman they mocked would soon hold the life of one of the most powerful men in the country in her scarred right hand. Anya Sharma wasn't a failure. Anya Sharma was a weapon in repose, and the time for rest was almost over. The hospital hummed with a different kind of energy that week, a nervous thrum that vibrated up from the polished terrazzo floors. Sterling Memorial was a good hospital, but it was a regional player, not a world-renowned institution. The news that a VIP was arriving had sent a shockwave through the administration. Rumors flew like pathogens in the unfiltered air of the cafeteria. Some said it was a senator, others a reclusive tech billionaire. Dr. Finch, naturally, positioned himself at the very center of the storm. He walked the halls with an even more pronounced swagger, his white coat so starched it seemed to crackle with self-importance. The patient's team specifically requested me, he announced at morning rounds, a statement of dubious veracity. They know that when you want the best, you come to Sterling. You come to Finch. He assigned tasks with the gravity of a general deploying troops. He demanded the entire executive wing be cleared, the finest linens procured, the dietary staff briefed on a menu that sounded more suited to a Michelin-starred restaurant than a hospital. Anya watched it all from the periphery, a silent observer in the unfolding drama. Her days remained a litany of menial tasks, a deliberate campaign of marginalization orchestrated by Finch. Sharma, the VIP suite needs to be sterilized, twice. I want you to personally wipe down every surface. Your attention to detail is famously thorough, he'd said, handing her a bucket and a stack of rags with a flourish that drew snickers from the junior residents. She did it without complaint. As she cleaned, her movements methodical and efficient, she noticed things the frantic, high-level planners had missed. A faint, almost invisible leak in the oxygen port, a subtle flicker in the overhead surgical lamp, a missing adapter on the backup generator outlet. She made a quiet list, and just as quietly, submitted a maintenance request under a generic login, knowing it would be fixed, but that she would receive no credit. It wasn't about the credit, it was about the integrity of the space. A well-prepared field was essential, whether it was an operating room in a billion-dollar hospital or a blood-soaked tent in the Hindu Kush. Later that day, Finch cornered her in the hallway outside the ICU. He was holding a tablet, scrolling through what she knew was her personnel file. It says here, you attended a state medical school, Sharma. Barely passed your boards, I see. He was lying, but he said it with such conviction that the nurse beside him nodded knowingly. You know, I went to Johns Hopkins, summa cum laude, then a fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic. Do you know the difference between you and me, Sharma? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. It's not just the school, it's the breeding, the instinct. Some of us are born to hold the scalpel. Others, he glanced at her scarred hand, are born to clean up after. He straightened up, his public voice returning. Now be a dear and run these blood samples down to the lab, and try not to trip over your own feet on the way. He strode off, leaving her in a wake of expensive cologne and quiet humiliation. Anya stared after him, her jaw tight. She felt the familiar phantom ache in her femur, a dull throb that always accompanied a spike in her anger. In her pocket, her fingers found the cool, worn metal of a small, heavy coin. It was her challenge coin from the 75th Ranger Regiment, given to her by a young soldier whose life she'd saved. The inscription was nearly smooth from years of touch, but she knew the words by heart. Sua sponte, of their own accord. A reminder of initiative, of acting when others would not. Her phone buzzed, a single, coded vibration pattern. She slipped into a vacant supply closet, the smell of bleach and sterile gauze a strange comfort. The caller ID was blocked. She answered. "Go," she said, her voice a low rasp. The voice on the other end was tinny, urgent, and spoke in clipped, military-style brevity. "Valkyrie, package is en route. Unscheduled arrival. Significant trauma. Vehicle incident. ETA 5 mics. Authentication code is Sierra, Alpha, Bravo, Echo, Romeo." Anya's blood ran cold. Valkyrie. No one had called her that in 3 years. It was her call sign, the name that had been whispered with a mixture of awe and terror in the most dangerous places on Earth. Package meant a high-value asset. Her asset. "Acknowledged," she rasped, and hung up. The world suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. The vague, institutional hum of the hospital was gone, replaced by the thumping of her own heart, a drumbeat counting down to chaos. The VIP wasn't a senator. The VIP wasn't a billionaire. The VIP was coming, and the carefully constructed anonymity of Dr. Anya Sharma was about to be blown apart. The storm broke not with a thunderclap, but with the shriek of sirens. The sounds sliced through the placid afternoon air of Sterling Memorial, growing from a distant wail to a gut-wrenching scream that seemed to shake the very windows. It wasn't the single, almost polite siren of a standard ambulance run. This was a chorus, a cacophony of multiple emergency vehicles converging with military precision. Dr. Finch was in the main lobby, preening for a local news crew he had invited against hospital policy, when the first vehicle, a black, heavily armored SUV, screeched to a halt at the ER entrance, followed immediately by 2 state trooper cruisers and an ambulance. Finch's perfectly curated press moment was shattered. His face, a mask of annoyance, turned towards the commotion. "What in God's name is this?" he muttered, striding towards the doors, his sycophants trailing behind him. The rear doors of the ambulance flew open before it had even fully stopped. Paramedics swarmed out, their movements tense and frighteningly urgent. "Clear a path! Get us a trauma bay now!" one of them yelled, his face pale and spattered with blood. They pulled out the gurney, and the assembled staff gasped. The man on the stretcher was large, with a shock of silver hair, his face a grim mask of pain. He was wearing the tattered remains of a military dress uniform, dark with blood. An IV bag was already running, and a makeshift pressure dressing was wrapped around his chest. It was a scene of controlled chaos. Finch pushed his way forward, his annoyance replaced by a predatory gleam. This was it, the main event. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Surgery," he announced, his voice booming with authority. "What's his status? Get him to OR3. My team is prepped and waiting." Anya was already there. She hadn't run. Her limp, usually a subtle drag, had vanished. She had moved with a fluid, predatory grace, appearing at the edge of the ER bay as if summoned from the shadows. She had heard the code over the comms. Sierra, Alpha, Bravo, Echo, Romeo. SABER. The call sign of her former commanding officer. The man on the gurney, the man whose life was draining away with every frantic beat of his heart, was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A living legend.
And her friend.
Finch was trying to direct the paramedics toward the elevators, barking orders about protocols and his own readiness. But General Thorne, his eyes slitted open with excruciating effort, saw past him. His gaze locked onto the quiet figure in the faded blue scrubs standing just behind the chaos. His breath hitched. A flicker of disbelief, then profound relief, crossed his face. He tried to lift a hand, his fingers twitching. "Val Kyrie," he rasped, the name a ghost of a sound, lost in the din. But Anya heard it, and she saw what the others, blinded by Finch's bluster, had missed. The uneven rise and fall of Thorne's chest, the telltale distension of the veins in his neck, the rapidly dropping blood pressure on the paramedic's monitor. Tension pneumothorax and cardiac tamponade. A collapsed lung was flooding his chest cavity, and blood was filling the sac around his heart, squeezing it to a stop. He had minutes, maybe seconds. "We don't have time for the OR," Anya said.
Her voice was still a rasp,
but it cut through the noise like a shard of glass. Finch spun around, his face a caricature of outrage. "Who the hell do you think you are, Sharma? I am in command here. Get out of the way before you contaminate my patient." He made to shove her aside. But then the monitor beside the gurney let out a single, piercing, continuous shriek. Flatline. General Thorne's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp. "He's coding!" a nurse screamed. The room exploded into panic. Finch froze. For one fatal second, the chief of surgery, the man from Johns Hopkins with the pedigree and the Rolex, stood utterly, completely still, his eyes wide with horror. He was a peacock, magnificent in display, but useless in a fight. The chaos swirled around him, a vortex of shouting and fear. People were running for the crash cart, fumbling with defibrillator paddles. It was then that Anya acted. She didn't shout. She didn't wait for permission. She moved. Sua sponte.
of their own accord.
Chaos reigned. But for Anya Sharma, it was simply a Tuesday. The shrieking monitor, the panicked shouts, the smell of blood and fear. It was a sensory landscape she knew better than the quiet halls of Sterling Memorial. It was home. While Finch stood paralyzed, a statue of useless arrogance, Anya's world narrowed to the man on the gurney and the rapidly closing window of his life. "Crash cart, now!" she commanded. Her voice, though raspy, cracked with an authority that stunned the nearest nurse into immediate action. The nurse, a young woman named Chloe, who had often giggled at Finch's jokes at Anya's expense, now looked at her with wide, terrified eyes and shoved the heavy cart toward her without a second thought. "I need a 14-gauge angiocath, a large-bore syringe, and a sterile field, now," Anya barked, her hands already moving, tearing open Thorne's tattered shirt. "What are you doing? Stop her!" Finch finally roared, snapping out of his stupor.
He lunged for her,
his face purple with rage. "Security, get this incompetent resident away from my patient!" But before he could reach her, two men in dark suits, part of Thorne's security detail, moved with silent, fluid speed. They didn't touch Finch. They simply stepped into his path, two immovable objects, their faces blank, their eyes cold. The message was clear. Finch skidded to a halt, sputtering. Anya ignored him completely. She had the angiocath in her scarred right hand. Her eyes scanned Thorne's chest, her mind a supercomputer of anatomical knowledge. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. A textbook location, but textbooks didn't account for the chaos of a real-world trauma. Her touch was sure as she palpated the rib. There. No time for sterile field, she rasped to herself. She ripped open an alcohol wipe with her teeth and swiped it once over the spot. Hold him steady. She didn't look to see who she was talking to, but two paramedics immediately complied, their hands pressing down on Thorne's shoulders. With a single decisive movement, she plunged the long needle into his chest. There was a sickening pop as it punctured the pleura, followed by a loud hiss, the sound of trapped air escaping his chest cavity, like a punctured tire. The right side of General Thorne's chest immediately began to rise and fall, in rhythm with the ambu bag a paramedic was squeezing. The pressure on his one good lung was relieved. The O2 saturation on the monitor jumped from 75 to 88. A collective gasp went through the ER staff. They had just witnessed a needle decompression, a life-saving cowboy trick of battlefield medicine performed with terrifying speed and precision. But Anya wasn't done. The flatline tone was still screaming. Heart still silent. Tamponade, she stated, her voice a flat, cold instrument of diagnosis. I need a spinal needle and a 60 cubic centimeter syringe. Another nurse, scrambling, slapped them into her waiting hand. Finch was practically vibrating with fury. That's a pericardiocentesis. You'll puncture his heart, you fool. You need ultrasound guidance. This is not some back-alley butchery, he shrieked. There's no time for ultrasound, Anya shot back without looking at him, her focus absolute. His heart is being crushed. He has less than 60 seconds. Her eyes were fixed on the junction of the xiphoid process and the left costal margin. She angled the needle, her scarred hand impossibly steady. This was the part that separated the surgeons from the gods. A millimeter too far, and she'd lacerate the ventricle. A degree off, and she'd hit the liver. She advanced the needle slowly, her other hand on Thorne's carotid artery, feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. Push. Aspirate. Nothing. Push further. The memory of a dusty tent, the smell of sand and blood, the rhythmic thump of distant explosions flashed through her mind. She'd done this under fire, with only a flashlight held by a terrified private. This, under the bright, clean lights of the ER, was simple. She pushed another half centimeter. Her fingers felt a subtle pop as the needle entered the pericardial sac. She drew back on the plunger. The syringe began to fill with dark, non-clotting blood. 10 cc's, 20, 30. The ER was dead silent, the only sound the squeak of the plunger and the god-awful steady tone of the flatline. 40 cc's, 50. And then, a miracle. On the monitor, a single, beautiful, jagged green line appeared. A beat, then another. Beep, beep, beep. The flatline alarm ceased. The rhythmic, life-affirming pulse of the ECG filled the silence. General Thorne's carotid artery, under Anya's fingers, gave a weak, thready, but definite thump. A wave of audible sighs and muttered, "Oh my gods," swept through the room. Anya pulled the needle out, her movements economical. She secured the catheter she'd left in his chest. "He's back," she said, her voice a low rasp. "But he's bleeding out internally. He needs an OR. Now. She finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the doctors and nurses and landing, at last, on Dr. Alistair Finch. Her eyes, usually so tired and distant, were blazing with an intensity that made him physically recoil. It wasn't the look of a burnt-out resident, it was the look of a commander. The spell of stunned silence was broken by Finch's sputtering rage. He saw his authority, his entire world, being dismantled in real time by the woman he considered less than dirt. The successful procedures didn't register as competence to him, they registered as a threat, a personal attack on his status. "She got lucky," he bellowed, his voice shrill. "A blind pig finding an acorn. This changes nothing. I am the chief of surgery, and I am in command here. Security, I told you to remove her." He pointed a shaking finger at Anya, who was now calmly checking the general's pupils. The two dark-suited security men didn't move. Their eyes were fixed on Anya with a look of dawning, reverent recognition. They had seen miracles on the battlefield before, and they knew one when they saw it.
"Sir,"
one of the agents said, his voice a low rumble, addressed to Finch, but clearly for everyone's benefit. "The general is not your patient." Finch's jaw dropped. "What did you say? This is my hospital." Anya ignored the squawking. "He has a massive splenic laceration, possibly a liver tear as well. He's filling his abdomen with blood. We move him to the best-equipped OR, and we do an exploratory laparotomy. We have maybe 10 minutes before he codes again from blood loss." Her words were not suggestions. They were orders. The ER staff, who moments ago had been Finch's loyal audience, now looked to her, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They started moving, prepping the gurney for transport, calling up to the OR to prepare for a massive transfusion protocol. They were her team now. As they began to push the gurney towards the elevators, General Thorne's eyes fluttered open again. This time, there was more consciousness in them. His gaze was weak, but laser-focused on Anya. His hand, shaking with effort, lifted from the gurney, and his fingers wrapped around her wrist. The grip was surprisingly strong. "Valkyrie," he breathed, the name clearer this time, a rough diamond of sound. "Only you, no one else." His eyes shifted, finding Finch's furious face in the crowd. A flicker of the general's famous iron will sparked in his gaze. "Not him," Thorne rasped, a clear, direct order. The declaration hung in the air, an irrefutable edict from the patient himself. The VIP patient, the man the entire hospital had been turning itself inside out for, had just refused its chief of surgery. Finch's face went from red to a waxy, sickly white. "He's delirious. He's not medically competent to make that decision," he screeched, his voice cracking. "I will not have my authority undermined by a janitor with a lucky needle. I am taking him to my OR, and you," he jabbed his finger at Anya again, "will be arrested for assault and practicing medicine without privileges." He made a final, desperate lunge to grab the gurney. This time, the lead security agent did move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply put a hand on Finch's chest, stopping him cold. The agent leaned in, his voice a deadly whisper that only Finch could hear. "Doctor, you will take one more step, and I will put you on the floor. You will stand down. That is not a request." Finch froze, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. He looked from the agent's granite face to the gurney disappearing into the elevator with Anya at its side, her hand resting reassuringly on the general's shoulder. The doors slid shut, leaving Finch alone in the middle of the ER, surrounded by the silent, judging stares of his own staff. The air, which moments ago had crackled with his authority, was now thick with his humiliation. He had no idea it was about to get so much worse. Just as the elevator doors closed, sealing Finch in his public disgrace, a new commotion erupted at the ER entrance. This was not the controlled chaos of a medical emergency. This was the quiet, overwhelming force of absolute power arriving. A black sedan with government plates had pulled up silently behind the other emergency vehicles. Two men in crisp, dark suits emerged, followed by an Air Force officer whose uniform was decorated with the eagles of a full colonel. He moved with a purpose that parted the lingering crowd like the prow of a ship. His eyes scanned the ER, taking in the blood on the floor, the discarded medical wrappers, the pale, shocked face of Dr. Finch.
The colonel's gaze was sharp.
Intelligent, and held zero tolerance for nonsense. He was followed by a woman in a severe grey suit, holding a briefcase chained to her wrist. "I'm Colonel Davies, General Thorne's Chief of Staff," the officer announced, his voice calm, but carrying the ingrained authority of command. "Where is he?" The hospital administrator, a portly, sweating man named Henderson, who had been hiding in his office, finally scurried out. "Colonel, thank God, we have the situation under control. Dr. Finch, our chief of surgery, is handling everything." Henderson gestured toward Finch, who tried to compose himself, straightening his coat and attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace.
Colonel Davies's eyes
Flickered to Finch for a bare second, a look of utter dismissal, before turning back to the ER staff. "I repeat, where is the general?" Nurse Chloe, the young nurse who'd first responded to Anya, found her voice. "They just took him up to OR 6, sir. Dr. Sharma is with him." At the name Sharma, Colonel Davies's entire demeanor changed. The stern mask of command softened into one of profound relief, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "Sharma?" he repeated, a note of hope in his voice. "Anya Sharma? About 5'6", dark hair, has a slight limp." Chloe nodded, bewildered. "Yes, sir, that's her." A slow smile spread across the colonel's face. He turned to the bewildered administrator and the pale doctor.
Finch.
"Well," he said, the relief in his voice now tinged with cold steel. "It seems the general is in the best possible hands on the planet." Finch, seeing an opportunity to reclaim his narrative, stepped forward. "Colonel, with all due respect, Dr. Sharma is merely a junior resident. She is not credentialed for this level of surgery. She acted recklessly, against my direct orders. I must insist." Colonel Davies cut him off, not by raising his voice, but by lowering it. "Dr. Finch," he said, tasting the name as if it was something foul. "Let me be perfectly, crystal clear." He took a step closer, and the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The woman you call a junior resident is Colonel Anya Sharma, United States Army Medical Corps. Until her recent sabbatical for a special research project, she was the Chief of Combat Trauma Surgery for the entire Joint Special Operations Command. The surgical techniques your own hospital now teaches for catastrophic hemorrhaging, she invented 2 of them. The diagnostic protocol for blast wave lung trauma, she wrote it. In Afghanistan, they didn't call her doctor, they called her Valkyrie, because she was the one who decided who lived and who died, and she rarely made the wrong call. Each word was a hammer blow, striking the foundations of Finch's world. The assembled staff stared, their jaws slack. The whispers started, a wave of shock and disbelief rippling through the room. "Colonel Sharma," Davies continued, his voice resonating with cold fury, is the recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for performing a 6-hour emergency thoracic surgery on 3 soldiers, simultaneously during a sustained enemy firefight. She holds patents on 3 different surgical instruments currently in use by every forward operating base in the military. She is, without exaggeration, one of the top 5 trauma surgeons alive. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked directly at Finch, his eyes burning with contempt. She is not credentialed at your hospital because her entire presence here is a classified research assignment arranged at the highest levels. An assignment you have apparently spent the last 3 years trying to sabotage by having her fetch your coffee. He turned to the ashen-faced administrator. So I suggest you get me to OR6. And you, Doctor, he said, turning back to Finch, you will stay here, and you will pray. You will pray that Colonel Sharma can save the life of a man you were seconds away from killing. The pronouncement was absolute. It wasn't just an order, it was a judgment. Finch stood, stripped bare, his arrogance and his lies exposed to the entire world, utterly and irrevocably broken. The atmosphere in Operating Room 6 was a universe away from the chaos of the ER. Here, there was only a cold, focused silence, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet hum of machinery. Anya Sharma stood at the center of it all, a high priestess in a sacred space. She had shed her faded blue scrubs for sterile green surgical attire. A mask covered the lower half of her face, but her eyes, visible above it, were sharp and intensely alive. The tired, defeated resident was gone. In her place stood Colonel Valkyrie Sharma, a commander in her element. The team she had assembled on the fly, the same nurses and anesthesiologists who had once mocked her, now moved with a crisp efficiency, their eyes locked on her, awaiting her every command. They had seen what she could do. They were believers now. "Scalpel," she said, her raspy voice the only sound in the room. A nurse slapped the instrument into her outstretched, scarred hand. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Her focus was entirely on the exposed abdomen of General Thorne. Starting the exploratory laparotomy, let's see what we're dealing with. With a long, steady, and impossibly straight incision, she opened the abdominal cavity. The moment the peritoneum was breached, dark blood welled up, confirming her diagnosis. "Suction," she commanded. "More lap pads. He's hemorrhaging from the upper left quadrant. Spleen is shattered, just as I thought. Get the cell saver ready. We're going to need every drop of his own blood back." Her hands moved with a dancer's grace and a mechanic's precision, a blur of motion as she clamped, suctioned, and explored. "Spleen is a loss. We're taking it out. Prep for splenectomy. I need a GIA stapler and 2O silk ties." Just then, the OR doors swung open. Colonel Davies entered, followed by a terrified-looking Administrator Henderson. They stayed by the wall, out of the sterile field, watching. A moment later, a thoroughly defeated doctor. Finch was escorted in by one of the security agents. He was stripped of his chief's coat, wearing simple scrubs, a mask hanging limply from his neck. His orders were to observe, to witness. "Colonel Sharma," Davies said quietly. "Status?" "Colonel," Anya replied, not taking her eyes off the surgical field. "General has a grade 5 splenic laceration and a partial tear in the left hepatic lobe. Abdomen was full of blood. I'm performing a splenectomy now and will move to repair the liver next. He's unstable, but holding. We've pushed 4 units of packed red cells and 2 of FFP. Anesthesiology is doing a fine job." The anesthesiologist, a man who had once called her the mop jockey, visibly straightened at the compliment. Finch, seeing a sliver of an opening to salvage a molecule of his dignity, stepped forward. "You should use a Pringle maneuver to control the bleeding from the liver," he said, his voice shaky but attempting to sound authoritative. "It's the standard textbook approach." Anya paused for a fraction of a second. She didn't turn. "The Pringle maneuver would cut off blood flow to the entire organ, Dr. Finch," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Given the general's hypertension and the amount of blood he's already lost, the resulting ischemia would likely cause irreversible liver failure within minutes. It's the wrong call." She reached for a delicate pair of forceps. "We're going to do a selective ligation of the damaged arterial branch instead. Suture." The rebuke was devastating in its quiet, factual simplicity. It wasn't an insult, it was a statement of professional truth. In front of her new team, the hospital administrator, and the colonel, she had just exposed Finch's textbook knowledge as lethally inadequate. Finch shrank back as if struck, his face burning with shame behind his mask. He was ordered to stand in a corner, a disgraced king, forced to watch his throne occupied by a worthier ruler. For the next 2 hours, he stood there, silent, as Anya Sharma performed a symphony of surgical brilliance, her scarred hands moving with a purpose and skill he knew, in his heart, he could never hope to match. The final stitch was a work of art. Anya had not just saved General Thorne's life, she had reconstructed him. The splenectomy was complete, the liver tear meticulously repaired with sutures so fine they were nearly invisible. The internal bleeding was stopped. The abdomen was irrigated and cleaned. She had worked with an unrelenting pace, calling out for instruments, issuing commands, and interpreting the complex data flowing from the monitors with an ease that was simply breathtaking. The entire OR team was locked in a state of flow with her, a well-oiled machine under the command of a master. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. For the nurses and techs in that room, it was the single most profound professional experience of their lives. They were not just participating in a surgery, they were witnessing the very definition of excellence. "Closing," Anya finally announced, her voice showing the first signs of fatigue. "Let's make it clean." As she began the final layers of sutures, the tension in the room finally began to dissipate, replaced by a wave of collective, exhausted relief. The beeps from the monitors were steady and strong. General Thorne's blood pressure was stable. His oxygen saturation was a healthy 98%. He was alive. He was going to live. When the last suture was tied and the dressing applied, Anya took a step back from the table. She stripped off her bloody gloves and mask, her face pale and beaded with sweat, but her eyes clear. The room was silent for a moment, a silence filled with a profound, unspoken awe. Then, the lead anesthesiologist, Dr. Marks, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause. Then Nurse Chloe joined in, her eyes shining with tears. One by one, every single person in the room, the scrub nurses, the techs, the circulating nurse, joined in, their applause filling the sterile space with a warmth and gratitude that was anything but clinical. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt tribute to the quiet woman they had misunderstood for so long. Administrator Henderson, his face a mess of sweat and relief, rushed forward. "Dr. Sharma, Colonel, I don't know what to say. That was magnificent. We are forever in your debt. Anything you want, anything at all, it's yours." Anya just gave him a tired, dismissive nod. She was looking past him, at Colonel Davies, who was approaching her not with applause, but with a look of immense, quiet pride. He was holding something in his hands, a crisply folded army dress uniform jacket. It was her jacket. On the shoulders were the silver eagles of a colonel. On the chest was a rainbow of ribbons, at the top of which sat the deep blue and white of the Distinguished Service Cross. "The General's aide brought this from his transport, ma'am," Davies said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said the General would want you to have it." He held it out to her. It was a gesture of profound respect, a public restoration of her true identity. In this temple of civilian medicine, he was returning her warrior's colors. Anya looked at the jacket, at the symbols of the life she had tried to leave behind. She reached out with her scarred hand and gently touched the Distinguished Service Cross. 1,000 memories flooded her. The dust, the blood, the faces of the young men and women she had saved, and the ones she had lost. She looked at General Thorne, peaceful under the blankets, and then back at the jacket. She didn't take it. "Thank you, Colonel," she rasped, her voice soft. "But I'm not that person anymore." Davies looked her in the eye, a deep understanding passing between them. "With all due respect, Colonel," he said softly, "you've never been anyone else." He gently draped the jacket over the back of a chair, leaving it there for her. It was a silent testament, waiting for her to reclaim it. Anya simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the OR, leaving behind a room full of changed people and the quiet, disgraced shadow of Dr. Alastair Finch. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in ER Bay 4 and OR 6 became the stuff of legend at Sterling Memorial. The whispers that had once been dismissive and cruel were now filled with awe and reverence. They didn't call her the Shadow anymore. They called her the Colonel. The official fallout was swift and brutal. Dr. Alastair Finch was summarily fired. The hospital board, under immense pressure from the Department of Defense and General Thorne's office, cited gross incompetence and conduct unbecoming of a chief physician. His medical license was suspended pending a full review, and rumors of a massive lawsuit for negligence and endangerment were all but confirmed. His career wasn't just over, it was annihilated. The last anyone saw of him, he was leaving the hospital with a cardboard box of his belongings, his face grey and haunted, avoiding the eyes of the same staff who had once worshipped him. The sycophants who had been his court jesters were either quietly let go or reassigned to the least desirable departments, their own careers permanently tainted by their association. Justice, it turned out, was not a blind goddess, but a patient sniper. Anya found herself in the uncomfortable glare of the spotlight. Administrator Henderson offered her Finch's job, chief of surgery, along with a staggering salary and a corner office. He grovelled, he pleaded, he promised her anything. Anya listened patiently in his plush office, the same office she had once been sent to deliver coffee. When he was finished with his desperate, sweaty pitch, she gave him her answer. "No, thank you," she said, her voice a quiet rasp. Henderson was flabbergasted. "But why? This is everything. You could run this department, change everything." Anya gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm not a politician, Mr. Henderson. I'm a mechanic. I fix what's broken. This requires a different skill set." She stood to leave. "You don't need me. You need to build a culture where the next person like me isn't ignored for 3 years." The words hung in the air, a final, damning indictment of the system he had overseen. She spent most of her time in the ICU, in the quiet room where General Thorne was recovering with remarkable speed. The guards outside his door, who once saw her as a menial worker, now snapped to attention whenever she approached. She would sit by his bed, and they would talk. Not about the surgery, or the hospital, or Finch. They talked about old friends, about dusty outposts with unpronounceable names, about the future. "They tell me you turned down the chief's job," Thorne said one afternoon, his voice regaining its familiar gravelly strength. "Can't say I'm surprised. You were never one for thrones." Anya just shrugged, checking the readouts on his monitor. "Thrones are too stationary, sir." He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "So, what's next for you, Valkyrie? Back to the sandbox?" Anya was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city below. "I don't know," she admitted. "My research project here is concluded. My cover is blown." She said it with a hint of dark humor.
I have an idea.
Thorne said, his eyes sharp. "What you said to that weasel Henderson, about building a new culture. What if you did just that? Not here. Somewhere new. Somewhere better." He went on to describe a project he and a few powerful, like-minded philanthropists had been planning for years. A national-level center for advanced trauma medicine and surgical innovation. A place that would bridge the gap between military and civilian medicine, a research and teaching hospital where the only currency was competence and the only hierarchy was skill. "It would be funded by the DoD and my foundation," Thorne said. "No hospital boards, no bean counters, just doctors and scientists pushing the envelope. We need someone to build it from the ground up, to lead it. Someone with the right pedigree." He used Finch's word, but he infused it with a new meaning. A pedigree of courage, sacrifice, and unparalleled skill. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "We need you, Anya." Anya stared at him, the sheer scale of the proposal sinking in. It wasn't a job. It was a mission, a chance to build a legacy, to create a sanctuary for healing and innovation, a place where the lessons learned in blood and fire could be used to save lives in peace. It was a chance to ensure that the heroes of tomorrow would be judged not by the polish on their shoes, but by the steadiness of their hands. A slow, genuine smile, the first anyone at Sterling Memorial had ever seen, spread across her face. "Where do we break ground, General?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. The rasp was almost gone. The weight she had carried for so long, the armor of humiliation and anonymity, had finally been set aside. She was no longer a shadow, no longer a ghost. She was Colonel Anya Sharma, and she was just getting started.